right, welcome everybody. Do you want to know how to create extraordinary performance through the power of positivity? My guest is going to do just that here today. Dr. Kim Cameron has transformed his groundbreaking research on positive leadership into multiple best-selling books, secured extensive consulting work with Fortune 500 companies, and even sought the attention of the U.S. military. His research has shown that positive leadership practices can lead to 45% better financial performance on Wall Street and double-digit improvements on healthcare, far beyond industry averages. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. And whether you're a CEO looking to transform your organization's culture or a thought leader ready to make a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Because today's episode is going to show you how focusing on the positive can create measurable, extraordinary results in any organization. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today, Kim Cameron. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Danielle. I am flattered and honored to be on your podcast, and you're making a big difference in the world. Thanks for doing this. Oh, my goodness.
Hey, I'm definitely not the one making the difference. You're the one out there with tons of best-selling books, sharing your impact, your knowledge. I mean, my goodness, our listeners here are in for a treat today because you've done some incredible stuff. Now, I just sort of looked through, what I could find online about you, your website, your tons of books. I flipped through your book about positive leadership a little bit too, so we'll talk about that as well in this podcast. But first things first, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners, give them a little taste for, your background and, what they might not know about you already. What can they know about you?
Well, not much. The best thing about me is that I've been married for 5 decades or more. We have 7 children, 25 grandchildren. That's by far the best thing. And, that sort of makes life worth living. And it was one of the families for Thanksgiving, so it was a great Thanksgiving.
I love that you start off with that first off. A lot of my guests might say I did this research, I studied this. I love that you put family first. Listeners, that's important, of course, especially around the holidays list. Family comes first, and the first thing that you're proud of is having your wife, and I love that. How else can you go about becoming so successful without somebody there by your side to support you like that? I love that.
Oh my goodness, I'd be a basket case without her.
Tell me about it. My boyfriend supports me all the time, so not to interrupt, but I just wanted to point that out. It's a great thing that you start off with that.
You're kind. I became involved in this research that we'll talk about today as a result of studying organizations that were downsizing, consolidating, retracting, laying people off, doing harm, frankly, to lots of people. And as you might expect, 80 or 90% of those organizations, after downsizing, deteriorated in performance, productivity, and trust, and morale, and all those things really took a beating. Not surprising. However, that left 10 or 15% of organizations that actually flourished after downsizing. So it became an interesting question. What in the world is the difference between these small number that got much better, flourished, and most other organizations that did not? Well, at the time, I didn't have data, but I got a distinct impression that the differences were that those who were flourishing were characterized by the term I used at the time was virtuous practices. Gratitude and trust and compassion and humility and generosity and so on. Those kinds of words. There's nobody in serious academic research, at least in my field, that was doing research on any of those words. That's kind of too religious, too philosophical, it's too hairy-fairy. But that led me to saying to myself, I got to figure out whether or not that's actually true. What are the practices that help organizations get better that shouldn't get better? That is, the prediction is they'll get worse, and they didn't. And since that time, a couple of decades of research on that, I've confirmed that multiple times in all kinds of industries, including professional athletics and, hockey and basketball and those kinds of things, financial services and healthcare and the military and the national intelligence agencies and places where you'd never expect it to make a difference, but it does. But probably the most frequent response, if I start talking about the word positive, The most frequent response is, wait a minute, Cameron, this is a deflection. In fact, it makes me angry to have you say, yeah, attention to positive practices. You're telling me just to sing a happy tune, think positive thoughts, put a smile on my face, and everything's going to be okay. It's not okay. I mean, I have quality issues. I have stock price pressures. I have customer satisfaction issues. I got productivity I've got to pay attention to. And you're telling me just to put a smile on my face and be happy, and everything's going to be okay. Baloney. In fact, they call it toxic positivity. So I've spent the last 20 years trying to make the case empirically. That is, regardless of whether you believe that whatever gratitude is helpful or not, here's what the data says. Here are the practices that, when implemented, show the following results. Anyway, so that's what's motivated all these writing. They're not best-selling books. I mean, I'm trying to talk about empirical data in a scientific case. I'm not just telling stories and motivational speaking, It's trying to build the case that essentially ignore this at your peril.
Right. Yeah. And you know what I love what you mentioned is another question that I was going to ask you. It actually directly branches off what you just said. The idea of being optimistic in your leadership, right? When I looked through one of your books, I was flipping through it and you came across something that actually sparked some interest in me. And that was when you said, without being Pollyanna-ish, it stresses positive communication, optimism, and strengths, but basically you were trying to say that you can't ignore the negative aspects as well. So I think a lot of your research goes to trying to find a big balance between the two. Would that be correct in saying so? And could you also give us a little bit of information, Pollyanna-ish? I did a little research myself, even just now, okay, where is he going with that? Who is Pollyanna? It's branching off of a fictional character, isn't it?
That's right.
Can you give us a little bit of information about that?
Exactly. Yes. It's a wonderful question and a very important question. The person who's the current president of the International Positive Psychology Association, his name is Roy Baumeister. He's a wonderful scholar. 10 years or so ago, he did a survey of the psychological literature, and the conclusion of that literature survey was captured by the title of the article he wrote. The article was, "Bad is stronger than good," which is true. I mean, if I give you a real criticism, I tell you what a dumb thing that was. It takes a lot of compliments, a lot of positives to overcome the effects of one negative, that emotionally, that is, in terms of our impact on attitudes and emotions. Bad is stronger than good. Parenthetically, good is stronger than bad if I want to change your behavior. If I want to teach you how to play tennis, I better show you when you're doing it right, not wrong. So it's opposite in terms of emotions. However, there's wonderful research by a person named Barbara Fredrickson, who's a wonderful positive psychologist, has done research now for the last 25 years or so on this, and primarily at psychological outcomes. She did an interesting study with a colleague discovering, I'll tell you the study, a little bit more about the study. It was a study of 60 top management teams and organizations who came to our university, University of Michigan, and were asked to do just work in a room specially designed in the business school, surrounded by one-way mirrors. So these people are just working in a room. On the other side of the mirrors are graduate students observing these people working and coding the communication going on in the room. In advance, these people had sent data in advance on their companies. 3 criteria. One is productivity, in whatever way they measured that. Customer satisfaction, in whatever way they measured that. And there was leadership ratings, 360, that is peers, superiors, and subordinates, had rated them as leaders. If they scored above average on those 3 criteria, they were categorized as a high-performing organization. If they scored below average, they were rated as a low-performing organization. So of the 60 organizations, we had low, medium, and high. One of the categories into which communication was coded by these graduate students was simply the number of positive statements being made relative to the number of negative statements being made. So what's a positive statement? Helpful, encouraging, supportive, approval. What's a negative statement? Disparaging, critical, undercutting, disapproval, and so on. Over the period of time, those organizations, the magic, the point of this whole thing is those high-performing organizations had an average of 5 positive statements made for every negative statement. Low performing organizations had an average of 3 negatives for every positive. That is simply communication predicted outcomes of those organizations. Communication meaning supportive, helpful, encouraging, and so on. Positive communication. Now, 2 or 3 things important. One is there is a 1. It's not 5 to 0. It's not 100 to 1. It's 5 to 1. And by the way, to be fair, there's a ratio between about 3 and about 8. Below 3, you don't get the advantages. Above 8, it's too syrupy. It's too sunshiny and Pollyanna-ish. But that 5 to 1 is crucial. So if organizations want to perform better than the norm, my prescription would be based on that research. And by the way, some follow-up research. You got to have more positive things going on than negative. You got to correct behavior. You have to not ignore, mistakes and errors. You have to make sure people are doing better. But in the context of the positive, if I say to my child, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, no, 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 pretty soon they just blank me out. But if I say, don't do that, and it's in the context of having 5 positives, they know that I've got their best interest at heart and they're attracted to me. That 1 will do a lot more than 5.
Yeah, I mean, that relates completely to me. In addition to doing, everything with All This on Mission, I also work as a teacher. So, it's interesting because a lot of what you said kind of applies to that. I'm not a business person, but, in a way, I'm running my own business in the classroom. You can't just keep telling the kids, no, 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 the same way you can't say that to your employees. You have to have a good balance of the positive and the negatives. It's about, fostering that community, that good rapport, and, same thing in the workplace. Who wants to listen to somebody, your boss, whoever? And I'm sure all of our listeners can probably relate to this too, that one boss that always comes in yelling. But it's about having the positive aspects. There's actually this one. Sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to be in your class.
There's one thing you always have to try to do, right? And it's to sandwich the positive, negative, and then another positive. We call it like the Oreo method. I'm sure you've heard of that in all of your research, right? So it's important to do that, but there also is value in that criticism, because then again, if you're always being praised, you're never going to improve. That relates to me too. If I hadn't tried to do something better in my life, I would still be where I was before, and now here I am. I'm able to work on a daily basis with people like you and improve myself by doing that. But if I'd never gotten criticism and improved myself, I wouldn't. So I can see exactly how that applies to so many lives beyond just businesses too. I mean, your work just transcends multiple layers.
It's so true. I mean, it reminds me, Danielle, of the kind of experiments that have done in schools. One of the experiments, for example, that just highlights the fact that people respond more, and in fact have an inherent tendency to respond more to positive than negative, was a school teacher simply did, this has, by the way, also been replicated multiple times. So a school teacher gives students a list of words. And one list would, say 10 words. And one list is puppies and sunshine and hugs and snowflakes or whatever. The other list is positive things, positive words. The other list are negative words. So crash and anger and whatever. And they simply asked them to memorize those words. Then a week later, without any cueing, they say, oh, by the way, remember those list of words? Write down as many words as you can remember. Over and over and over again, students remember significantly more positive words than negative words. It's illustrated by one of my most favorite studies. It's a study of children ages 3 months to 8 months. So we're talking about tiny little children. The study is you put the child on a caregiver's lap and they watch a puppet show for maybe 20 seconds. So a puppet tries to walk across the stage, tries to climb a hill, tries to open a box. Then there are 2 other puppets. One puppet tries to encourage, support. The other puppet tries to hinder, puts a block up, you can't make it up the hill, jumps in the box, you can't open the box. Then, after 20 seconds or so, you bring these 2 puppets out, put it in front of the child, and the child can select whichever puppet he or she wants to play with. Now these, depending on the study, these percentages differ, but we're talking about almost 90% of the children select the puppet that tries to help rather than tries to hinder. That is, from the time you were 3 months old, long before you learn language, long before you're socialized, there's an inherent tendency toward the positive and away from the reverse. So human beings You got to give them a chance to respond to what's inherent in human nature.
I love that study that you just mentioned. I'm sure there's a lot of studies out there that kind of say the same thing. And one thing I'm noticing too is a lot of everything you're saying is backed by studies and research. This whole conversation, every point you've made has been backed by something like that. And, it's not only interesting and fascinating to hear about, but also it's giving credibility to everything you're saying. And the reason I'm saying this is because our listeners are always thinking about ways to make their own books. And I mean, to our audience right now, if you're trying to write your own book, this is how you have to model it right after Kim Cameron, because he has these amazing insights, but they're not just like talk positive. He's saying it's actually backed up by research, guys. And you're saying it with so many different ways. Another thing that you haven't mentioned yet is, I looked at the Google Talk that you have online, and within that, you mentioned something about a whole study with nuns and how their impact and their outlook on life. It was like a 70 to 20% increase between their positive outlook versus negative. I mean, just another amazing example. And maybe that's something else you can tell us a little bit about. But again, it's always important to back up your research.
Bless your heart.
Amazing.
Thank you. This is a wonder. I didn't do this study, but it was done by a colleague who I know well. What happened is that the study was done in a convent, 678 nuns living in a convent. They discovered the journals or diaries of 180 of these women when they entered the convent 60 years before. Some of these women were saying things like this: "This is the culmination of my life's dream. I'm so happy to enter the order. This is such a blessing. And this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be a sacrifice. It's going to be difficult, but I'm committed. I'm going to follow through." Different? Well, they just put nuns in two groups, depending on which type of journal they were keeping. On the one hand, this is a blessing. On the other hand, this is a real challenge. 60 years later, they simply counted the number of nuns alive in each group. Now, these numbers aren't precise, but they're very close, and they represent the difference. Of the 90 nuns in the first group, 70 were alive. Of the 90 nuns in the second group, 10 were alive. And at every decade, there was a significant difference in mortality rates, not to mention morbidity or chronic illness rates. Those people who were essentially defining their environment as a positive blessing lived longer, on the average of about 9 years longer than those that were defining this as I'm going to gut this through, I'm going to make it through, I mean, I think it's a really, it just shows an inherent ability. Now, there's a lot of data that explains why that's the case. I mean, I'll give you one more study. I have a friend who works at an organization. They study heart rhythms, and they simply measure your heart rhythms when you're in a gratitude appreciative condition, and they measure heart rhythms when you're either neutral or especially when you're frustrated, stressed, angry, and so on. The pattern of your heart rhythm is very rhythmic in that virtuous gratitude state, and on the other hand, it's like this in that frustration stress case. You don't control that. It's heliotropic. That's what we call it. It's inherent in the human condition. But you can see after 60 years, I mean, this is probably not going to be very healthy, And so that's essentially the argument is that, there's a lot of research that suggests inherent in human beings, if you give them a chance, is to become positive and respond to positive.
I like that you mentioned if you give them a chance. How would you say if they're not given a chance? Would you say that's, under poor leadership, perhaps? Or
that's a wonderful question. That's primarily where I've spent my energy and effort lately, last 10 years or so, is on the leadership of the organizations, because leaders, as it turns out, are the single most important predictor of performance. Strategy matters, culture matters, incentive systems matter, processes matter. But if you have all of those in place and you got an absolute jerk or an idiot for a leader, it's probably not going to work. So having a great leader is important. No question about that. Everybody agrees with that statement. Having a positive, energizing leader, a positive leader, is even more important. Now, what does that mean? That means a person not only who can be a role model and who can unleash this natural tendency people have to respond positively to the positive, But there are a bunch of practices that I've seen leaders implement in their organizations that have made a lot of difference and that have empirical evidence that when practiced, they produce outcomes. For example, this study, I've done this study, but many people have done this study. And it's the best example probably is students as opposed to employees in an organization. But here's a study. So let's assume I have a group of students and I say to these students, I want you to, in my class, you have to keep a journal and you have to write in your journal every single day. However, half of you are assigned to write every single day 3 things for which you're grateful, or the best things that happened to you today or this week. The other group, just write down 3 interactions, 3 problems you faced, 3 events. So I've got a journal group, I've got a gratitude journal group. At the end of the semester, I'm going to do several studies. For example, I'm going to give everyone a flu shot. 7 days later, I'll test for the number of antibodies in your system. Those people keeping a gratitude journal are going to be healthier. They're going to be more antibodies in your system in 1 week, in 7 days, than the other group. I give you a mental acuity task. What's that, or test? What's that? You have to memorize information. You have to remember information. You have to come up with some sophisticated decision rules for complex data. Those keeping a gratitude journal are going to score higher on mental acuity than the other group. I can affect test scores. We've done studies worldwide and test scores go up. I give you a creativity task. What's that? Well, think of all the things you can use a brick for, or a ping pong ball, or a piece of paper. There are more ideas in the positive group and a broader variety of ideas in the positive group. That is, it's called mental flexibility. I can literally affect how people perform in the classroom. So the whole point of that is, one option for leaders is to simply implement some practices like gratitude journals, like recognition, like giving people opportunities to contribute as opposed to just receive. In fact, Danielle, you wrote a wonderful email to me before the interview and asked me if I would highlight one of the studies related to contribution. So Let me use that in this context. This study was done of kidney dialysis patients. These people are hooked up to a kidney dialysis machine, can't go anywhere. They were measured on 2 factors. One factor is to what extent are you being loved, supported, and cared for by somebody? The other is to what extent, the other thing they were measured on is to what extent are you making a difference in somebody else's life? You're contributing to them, you're making supporting, helping, loving them. As it turns out, the second score, the highest, when the score was higher on making a difference in somebody else's life, health consequences were significantly higher. People healed more, they were healthier. That's confirmed actually by a more precisely designed study. In that particular study, they took multiple sclerosis patients, MS patients. Half of these people were assigned to receive a phone call once a week, having somebody express love, support, and concern to them. The other half of these people were assigned to place a phone call to somebody else, expressing love, support, and concern to them. After 2 years, they simply measured well-being, self-efficacy, that's confidence, competence, physical activity, hope, depression. 8-fold difference. Those people who placed the phone call were 8 times healthier than those people who received the phone call. That is contribution, and there are many studies that confirm this. Contribution redounds to the benefit of the individual more than does receipt. So, if I'm a leader in an organization, I'm going to make really sure that I give my employees opportunities to contribute. Sometimes that's volunteering. Sometimes it's saying, Danielle, you're so spectacular. What we need to have you do is mentor or coach, because we need to have Aaron as good as you are. And because you're such an outstanding performer, you get a chance to contribute or coach or help, and so on. I mean, there's a long list of just contributions. How do I help you make somebody else better? And that redounds to my benefit every time.
I like that. I like how you spun it back around to say how, like, and not only it's helping many other people, but also yourself too. And I'm sure that, like, just inside, it feels great to be helping so many different people. And I mean, aside from that, I'm sure there's many just like real tangible like benefits tied to even just your career and your everything too, just by having this research and these books published. Can you speak a little bit about like, it's been many years since you've published. You've had so many books out there, but how has your life changed since you put these ideas into words on print? I mean, I'm sure it's skyrocketed everything you've been doing.
Well, I'm not one of those people who can sit down and write a book and have it done in 2 weeks. I have colleagues who can. I suspect there are people much better at it than I am. For me, it takes a long time. I write and rewrite. But the motive is this hasn't been done before. This case hasn't been made before. This data, this research hasn't been broadly disseminated before. So I got to make sure I say it in a way that anybody would want to read it or that it actually makes the case. So, the latest book, Positively Energizing Leadership, that was written simply because we know a lot about leadership. We know a lot about positive. We don't know much about what it means to be energizing, positively energizing leader, and how you measure that, and how would you foster it? How would you help somebody become more of an energizing leader? So and it's not rocket science, it's just that it hadn't been written about before. So that's primarily my motive is let's get some information out there and let people get exposed to it. And then all kinds of interesting things occur. I mean, I'm amazed at periodically people say, oh, by the way, let me tell you what we did with such and such an activity. And it's always so inspiring. Oh, goodness.
I absolutely love that. I love how a lot of people do say this. They wrote their book, fill a need. And that's something you did. You found something that had to be written and you filled that need. And now, like you said, like the amounts of benefits and people that come back to you saying what your work has done, I'm sure it's shocking every time. Your email inbox just must be like overflowing with messages from people. I mean, I would assume, right? As soon as they read something, they implement it in their lives. I'm sure you just have so many examples of that. Do you have a recent, story you can share about somebody who reached out to you saying, what you just mentioned?
Sure, I do. And by the way, it's so obvious to me. You are a master at this, Danielle, because as a teacher, every day, you're not writing it out and handing it. But every day you're doing essentially what I do, except, here's a need, here's what you need to know, let me help you get it. I'm always impressed.
I appreciate that. But beyond teacher, as you know, I'm the Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission. So another great benefit is that I'm able to not only help students at my school who need help with their English and literature, that sort of thing, but authors all the time come to me too, and I'm able to sort of fill their gaps as well and figure out what they need. And that's kind of what our services do, because authors have ideas, they don't know, or business leaders have ideas, they don't know how to take it and make it into a book. For example, you had a challenge sort of like finding the time to write, finding the right way to say what you want to write, whatever it is, we're able to help them too. So I just wanted to branch that off you. I appreciate the compliments so much, but it comes from many different sources too that we're able to do this. So
the fact that you translate it so well, it's terrific. School teachers should be making 4 times what they make, I think. Well, I'll tell you one quick story.
Yes, please go back to that. Yes.
So we had an organization that came to us and said, we want to change the culture of our organization. What was daunting about that challenge was that it's the world's largest university consortium. It's an organization that owns universities, not in the United States, but lots in Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Middle East, lots in India, for example, Africa. The senior leaders, the presidents and chancellors of these universities from all around the world together for a 3-day event. They gave us 2 of the 3 days to help them understand what positive leadership is, what the empirical evidence is, just some examples of how people have been successful in other organizations. Then we asked them to identify positive energizers in their regions of the world. Just identify the positive energizers. Who are they? They're people who walk in the room and just brightens everything up. It's not necessarily extroverts. It's just people who help other people flourish. They help unleash potential in other people. You just feel like, gee, it's wonderful to be around you. 46 people were identified worldwide. Brought those people together. Many of them had never been to the United States before because it wasn't the senior level folks at universities. Anyway, we spent 2 days with them, identifying practices, giving them empirical evidence, helping them think about this, and then we gave them a 90 in 90 challenge. Their job, we said, your job is to infect 90% of the rest of this organization with positive values, positive practices, positive culture. And you have to do that in 90 days. 90% in 90 days. The first question, what does infect mean? We said, well, it means that people haven't been infected if they can explain what a positive culture is, what positive practices are, what it means to be a positive person, positive contributor, and they've attempted a 1% improvement in their own behavior. That's what 90 and 90 means. We just turned them loose. We didn't give them a script. We didn't tell them you have to do these things. They had to report back once a week. But in 90 days, they did report back. It was so inspiring. Oh my gosh. They made t-shirts and mugs. They had big events, and they had small little events. And they made almost every place made movies. One of the best ones was Costa Rica made a movie of what they were doing. And so, oh my goodness. In 90 days, 96% of 135,000 people had been infected. And as you might expect, the scores on all kinds of dimensions went up. Now that's happened even during the pandemic when everybody thought things were going to get awful. They went up. It's happened in organizations, including literally in athletics, for heaven's sake. Well, there are many studies about professional athletics and others, military organizations and so on. The data for me is very compelling that there's evidence that this matters, it works. And sometimes top-down interventions are resisted just because they're top-down. Okay, the boss has one more program, for heaven's sake. So you take it off the back of the boss. It's not the boss's program. You have a bunch of these people who are energizing, and they always capture others who are energizing too. And it's just a wave that goes through the organization. It just changes everything. There are a variety of those kinds of interventions that have become, for me, very compelling. And compelling in the sense that in organizations you'd never expect it to stick, it really does stick. It makes a difference. One of the other examples in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. So virtually all organizations are run by a member of the family, of which there are 2,100 people or so. Saudi Arabia, I'm going on and on and on, Danielle. This is, I don't.
Well, that's what this is all about. It's a podcast. We're here to hear you speak. Keep going.
So Saudi Arabia knows that, at least at the moment, their economy is completely dependent on what they call carbon-based economy, oil. Well, the oil is going to eventually run out. So there are estimates of when, but they know very clearly that if they maintain a carbon-based economy, things are going to go south. So they've decided they need to change to a digitally based economy. Well, that's a big deal because you got a competitive world out there, and Saudi Arabia is a kingdom and monarchy, and you don't have to compete with anybody. I mean, I have no choice but to buy Saudi oil if I'm in Saudi Arabia. Well, they decided the way they're going to do that is they spun off a business, meaning they took a business that was originally run by the royal family. The name of the business was Saudi Telecom. And they said, okay, Saudi Telecom, you've got to enter a competitive market and you've got to learn how to win in a competitive market, as opposed to everybody in Saudi Arabia uses Saudi Telecom. There's no other choice. So they called us up and said, come help us. Now, there are other people who did that as well, but it was a wonderful example of, in a place you'd never expect, to implement many positive practices. I've written this up and there's a long list of them, but it's sort of just inspiring. And Saudi Telecom is now the best, has the highest market share, making the most money in the entire UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on, the entire area of the country, of the world. They've succeeded. And it's many things, but one of them is positive practices. The person who led that entire effort was a master positive energizer.
Yeah, I mean, to all of our listeners right there, there's so much we can pull from these stories that Kim just shared with us. Going back to the whole idea is that, Kim, you're really a big data-driven guy. You love your research, and I feel like somehow you just remember all of this in your brain and you're able to recite it to people. And that in itself is something that, not only builds your credibility as like a thought leader, but also just like you can always just come up with this amazing anecdote that relates to anything you're talking about. I feel like it must translate to all aspects of your life. So, I mean, right there, that's an incredible thing. But also the fact that your ideas have resonated so much that you're influencing Saudi Arabia, you know what I mean? Like all over the world. And another reason why your book has spread out through all these different places. People, you probably had no idea when you first started this that it would make that much of an impact across the world, right? And I guess the third thing I wanted to say off of all that, it's very clear too that you don't just have this data and this research, but you're presenting it in a way that's interesting to hear about, right? You're using very simple words and telling it in a story format. And I'm sure that's exactly how you do it in your books too. I mean, so all of our listeners right now, take this as an example. When you're writing, do the same thing. Find the research, but don't just bullet point it out. Kim, you said it in such a natural way that came out like a story in a way that was just fun to listen to. You weren't just like spitting out facts,
Right,
so
you're
amazing,
very
three amazing things to come out of all of that. I mean, in addition to the work itself.
You're very kind. I can fool some of the people some of the time, Danielle.
Oh, I don't know if it's about fooling. You really seem to know your facts. I mean, I'm sure I can pull it up right now to double check you, but it's incredible that you know all this. I mean, and keeping all this in mind, I feel like you're just like a knowledge bank of all of this ideas in your brain. So like, what's next? Do you have another book in mind that you're going to come up with soon?
It's a good question. I'm currently spending a lot of time in activities that consolidate material and research. For example, I'm the editor of an entire book series for a professional association called the International Positive Psychology Association. And so we've created a series essentially written by among the best known positive psychologists in the world, who have all made contributions. And the book they're writing is Here's My Contribution, written by the person who produced it. So the go-to source by the go-to person. And that's an exciting kind of endeavor because pretty well-known folks are saying, okay, I'm going to really talk to you about what I think is really important. And here's my contribution to the world. So that's one thing that's capturing some of my attention. Another is we have a book that was the first edition is called the Oxford Handbook for Positive Organizational Scholarship. The first edition was published 13 years ago, and they've come to us and said, you need to do a second edition of that. And there are 79 chapters, some of which will be revised, some of which won't be.
So that's what I was going to ask, if it's all the same content or if you're adding to it, revising.
The chapters in this book is literally 79 different chapters. From emotions and attitudes to strategy and global implications and so on. And so we have 79 authors, or at least 79 first authors, because many of them are co-authored chapters. And we're just right now literally in the process of saying, if you've got something that you feel like is a contribution, let me know, because we've got an opportunity to do a book that's 80 chapters long, for heaven's sake, each written by somebody else. So that's taking.
Is that open to anybody who wants to write a chapter? For example, if one of our listeners wanted to jump in, I'm not sure how open that is, or
In fact, I'm going to turn my back on you a minute and grab the first edition. I'm just going to tell you.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask you, please share a copy of one of your books for us to see.
I could do that. Do that. Hang on.
Yeah. Hang tight, listeners.
So it's a big fat book, but some of the chapters, and the reason I'm reading these, Danielle, is because it may give individuals ideas about what they could contribute. There's a section on individual attributes like callings at work, positive identity, creativity, proactivity, and so on. There's a section on positive emotions having to do with subjective well-being and passion and emotional intelligence and group emotions and so on. There's one on strengths and virtues. So humility and compassion, hope, courage, justice, things you'd expect. another section on positive relationships, having to do with high quality connections and reciprocity and civility and intimacy and trust and so on. Another on human resource practices, including, for example, career development and mentoring, socialization, diversity, and negotiation, and so on. Another, I'm almost finished. Another one, organizational practices. For example, collective efficacy, design of work, mindful organization, innovation, and so on. And then the last, no, not the last section. Another section on positive leadership and change. Another section on positive problems or taking a positive approach to problems, healing after trauma, crises, resilience, and so on. And then the future. And there's a section on the future. So that's taking a lot of time, but a reason I mention it in this context is because there may be folks listening who say, you know what, I've got some good work and it needs to be distributed. It needs to be available. Having them write a proposal, having them give us a sense of what it is. It's not, each of these chapters are really grounded. They have theory and they have empirical evidence and so on. It's not just editorializing, but that sort of thing matters right now. Pull what we know together.
I like that. All about collaboration too. And by the way, don't ever say sorry. I'm so happy to share and hear some of your chapters. This is exactly what our listeners want to hear. They want to know about what you've written so that they can pick it up themselves when it's time. And I love that. I loved hearing those little experts. And yeah, I mean, there you go, listeners. It's all about collaboration. You know, it's all about it. So yeah, I mean, all in all, this has been an incredible talk. I've learned a lot about all of your work and your writing journey. I guess I just have one last question, and that's
Great.
if you can give, one piece of advice to our listeners today who might want to be following in your footsteps after being inspired by how much of an impact you've made, what would you say to them? One last piece of advice, what would you say?
I wish I had a masterful summary, that I could just
A little too hard to condense, right?
And I don't. But you, in advance, Danielle, you've mentioned 2 or 3 things that I could think about. One of which was if you're going to give somebody advice or something about that, what would you say? And I really don't have anything pithy and profound. But for me, life is worth living more because of positive practices, because of virtues, because of taking a perspective on even issues and problems that, you find the silver lining, you find a way to learn and so on. Even, listen, if you're in the United States and you know anything about athletics, you know that the biggest rivalry in football is between Michigan and Ohio State. In fact, 10 years or so ago, there was a Sports Illustrated article rating the biggest rivalries in the world. I mean, Barcelona, Madrid, Great Britain versus Wales, and so on. The number one rivalry was Ohio State versus Michigan in football. Okay.
I wouldn't have guessed that. That's funny.
Michigan does not have a particularly good team this year, but we won the national championship last year, and we've beaten Ohio State 3 times in a row. Well, over the Thanksgiving weekend, that was the big rivalry game. Ohio State was rated number 2 in the country. Michigan is not even rated. It's just not a good year for us. We don't have a good team. Michigan won. I mean, shocked the world, shocked us. All right, I can sort of thumb my nose at Ohio State, but frankly, I'm feeling really empathetic toward those guys. They thought they were going to just kill us, and they probably should have. The rumor is they spent $20 million on their starting football team. Anyway, so I think to myself, I can be bitter and angry and hostile. I can protest with anger. I can, call names of people. I can be ugly inside. Life's too short for that. So all these virtuous practices that we're studying, I just feel like it's grandmother's advice. It's what your mom told you when you were 4 years old, be nice. And that doesn't mean soupy syrupy. It doesn't mean everybody everybody gets a gold medal, everybody has a blue ribbon. Not at all. I mean, it means doing your very best. It means exceeding what normal behavior is. There's the philosophy of positive organizational scholarship is how do you achieve achieve much better than you expect, much better than the industry average, much better than the aspirations. Positively deviant, extraordinary, spectacular. You don't do that by saying, "Oh, it doesn't worry. Mistakes don't bother with those. Don't worry about that." Not true. You got to correct mistakes. You got to be rigorous. You got to be tough. You have to be aggressive. But at the same time, that's not antithetical to compassion, trust, graciousness, and so on. Anyway, I feel like if the world was virtuous, there would be no poverty, no war. Everybody'd be well educated. We'd all get along. I mean, it's just better than the alternatives. You know that because you teach that every day.
Yeah. I mean, in many different forms too, between teaching and also, listening to different authors and their experiences, editing books too. I mean, every person has their own things that they're going through. So it's really just a matter of that, along with all the other powerful, concepts you just included in that message too. I mean, with that, where can our listeners go to find out more information about you if they'd like to, perhaps pick up some of your books or learn about?
There is a website that simply is, see if I can remember. I have one of my children who made this up for me. The website is www.kimscameron.com.
KimSCameron.com. Yeah, it's an incredible resource. I checked it out myself earlier, everybody. It's got, a copy of his Google Talk on there, along with many different words and everything he's accomplished. So check it out because it's going to give you a great insight into all the research he's done and all of the work he's accomplished. And you know what? As we come to a close today, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's really an incredible journey you've been on, from studying organizational problems to uncovering, the power of positive leadership. I mean, what you've done, it not only challenges conventional wisdom, it's not, the status quo, but it provides really concrete evidence that just, leads to extraordinary results. I mean, that NUD study, for one thing, was a really great example of it. So all of our listeners, let's all say thank you for sharing your insights, showing us how your research and positive thinking can transform organizations and lives. So really just thanks again. Thanks for another amazing episode of Authors on Mission. And to all of our listeners, if this conversation about positive leadership and transformation sparked your author's journey as well, remember your knowledge deserves to be shared because Kim's work shows us how powerful these insights can transform organizations and lives. So feel free to reach out to him if you have any questions or check out his amazing books. Or likewise, check out authorsonmission.com, schedule a call today to find out about how we can help you sort of follow in the path of Kim and share your ideas and write your own books. And feel free to join us next time because we continue helping leaders like you transform your knowledge into impact. And with that, I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Until next time, keep writing, keep leading, and keep inspiring. And Kim, thank you again. Have a great day, everybody.
Danielle. You're terrific. You are terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.